This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, we're facing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis right now in Turkey and Syria. And we're going to be going to an interview that you did with Dr. Anis Germani in a minute here. But, estimates now are over 30,000 dead, hundreds of thousands of individuals who are displaced and homeless right now. So it's a big story. We're going to come back to that in a minute. You did an excellent interview with Dr. Anis Germani, and we're going to hear more about the live, up-to-date situation on the ground in Syria, actually. The Syrian situation has been neglected by the mainstream media here in the United States. It's been neglected by the world community, but not just the media has been neglecting what's happening in Syria. International humanitarian aid is not getting into Syria the way it is getting into Turkey. So we're going to be talking about that. There's a couple of other big stories. Obviously, we have the fake democracy demonstrations going on in Tel Aviv right now. We're going to be talking a little bit about the situation there on the ground. We're going to talk a little bit about what a top Israeli rabbi said also, where he said basically that the death of Turks and Syrians, basically Muslims and Christians, was ordained by God. So, we're going to try to wrap our minds around that kind of racism and Islamophobia in a second. And then finally, one of our favorite topics, and this is not breaking news, but we need to cover it anyways. The Washington Post did an investigative report and surprise, surprise, found that Jared Kushner and Donald Trump benefited from their relationship, that they, while they were in office, being paid by U.S. tax dollars, benefited personally from their relationships with the Crown Prince and other Gulf leaders. So we have a lot to cover today, but I think first we have to see this interview that you did with Anis Germani.
That's right. Just commenting on Jared Kushner and Donald Trump. Not only they did profit, but MBS basically bailed them out, because after Trump left office, both the Trump Corporation and Kushner's financial positions were in basically in the red, and he bailed them out. And we've been talking about this for several months, actually,
Right.
for the past more than a year. But you're right. Let's go to Dr. Anis Germani. He spoke to me from Beirut. Rescuers continue to pull out more survivors from the rubble in Turkey and Syria as the death toll from the 7.8 and 7.5 magnitude earthquakes that hit southeastern Turkey and northern Syria last week had risen to over 36,000, and it is expected to continue to go up as rescuers find more bodies in the destruction. According to the International Rescue Committee's president, David Miliband, a massive aid effort underway in Turkey, but delays in aid to Syria might cause a secondary crisis for Syrians already suffering from years of war. Joining us from Beirut to discuss this and more is Anis Germani, a political activist and a medical doctor. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Anis.
Thank you, Jamal. It's good to be here again.
So the doctors in northwest Syria say that they are completely overwhelmed by the devastating earthquakes that struck the region earlier this week, and don't have the resources or necessary equipment to address the severity of the injuries endured by survivors. Tell us about the medical conditions in Syria, particularly in the region most affected by the earthquakes.
Well, Jamal, it's no surprise that the healthcare sector, the Syrian healthcare sector, that once provided socialized medicine, has completely collapsed. More than 10 years of war, crippling sanctions, mass migration of any qualified personnel have left it completely depleted of any material and human resources for it to be able to function. Adding to it now this crisis that was brought on by the earthquake has completely overwhelmed it, even though it was already, on its knees, if you want to say. It's actually, it's a bit reminiscent of the Lebanese healthcare system after the explosion of August 4th at the port. When you get this sudden rush of thousands upon thousands of patients, any highly functional healthcare sector would find itself overwhelmed. So what would be the case of a healthcare sector that is completely destroyed and ravaged?
So the first United Nations convoy arrived in northwest Syria from Turkey 3 days after the earthquake. Martin Griffith, the UN aid chief, has said rescue efforts are coming to a close, and that the world has so far failed people in northwest Syria, saying survivors there rightly feel abandoned. As a medical doctor, tell us how these delays in aid have exacerbated the situation.
Well, the thing is that it's not a strictly medical problem. So when there's an earthquake and buildings collapse, usually it's a race against time. So there are people who are, first of all, there's a huge number of people who are injured. They have immediate needs that have to be met, like cuts, bleeds, bruises, hemorrhages, the likes. These people who have not been interred under buildings, these people rush to hospitals and they seek urgent care. However, there's people who are also stuck under their buildings, in their apartments. These people need to be found immediately. For many reasons. First of all, they lack food, water. Some of them might be injured. So in order to excavate, the collapsed buildings, a lot of people are required and a lot of tools as well. Usually, on average, rescue missions in the context of earthquakes last around a week. And today marks the 7th day after the onset of the double earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria. So we can definitely expect that as of now, the mortality rate is going to be much higher, and unfortunately, the survival rate is gonna drop tremendously. I mean, we are still finding some people who are still alive, which adds, it adds the disappointment that these people need to be, helped as soon as possible. And at the same time, we're very pessimistic about the future prospects of finding other people. So in that sense, delaying aid to these people is basically condemning them to certain death.
Doctors in Aleppo have been saying that while most medical staff were having to condemn, which is really what you're talking about with injuries, broken arms, legs, infected wounds, they say that the coming days would likely seem to have to contend with waterborne diseases such as cholera and an uptick in COVID-19 cases and instances of hypothermia or frostbite. Is there a concern about the spread of now diseases there?
Well, there was already a concern long before the earthquake. There was already a huge outbreak of cholera in Syria that has spread also to Lebanon, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of cases. That is no joke. And these infectious diseases tend to run rampant in context of resource scarcity, of war, of massive displacement. All of these conditions were already pre-existing long before the earthquake, and now they have been exacerbated tremendously. Adding to that, today we are in the winter season. It can get quite cold in the internal regions in Syria. So definitely these thousands of people who find themselves today without housing, adding to the thousands of refugees. Some of them in Turkey have also been, like some refugees that were in camps have been moved, have been kicked out of these camps to make place for Turkish people who were like left homeless as well. So we can definitely expect a lot of problems, and people who are displaced, they cannot access clean water and food. They do not have access to healthcare. So all of these things are basically a recipe for infectious diseases to run rampant among communities, for sure.
So recently, the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control issued Syria General License GL-23, which authorizes for 180 days all transactions related to earthquake relief that would be otherwise prohibited by the Syrian sanctions regulations, or the CSR. What are your thoughts on this? I saw a tweet that you posted, kind of questioning the motives behind this.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of one of those rare moments where the U.S. administration highlights the hypocrisy of people who tend to distance themselves from, State Department kind of talking points. So there was this debate that was restarted following the earthquake, and that is that are sanctions against a country that finds itself today in a disaster area, are they ethical? Are they humane? And I think the most exceptional thing, and I think the pinnacle of hypocrisy, was that we have these people who consider themselves, on the left or liberal. They position themselves in the sense that yes, we need to help the Syrian people, but at the same time we need to keep the sanctions on. So this, for me, made absolutely no sense, and I assumed at the time that there would be like a general consensus about the destructive impact of sanction. Apparently not. So I tried to pull, a list of evidence regarding sanctions during the past 30 years. And I think this is the span of 30 years. One was when we seriously started to examine the effect of sanctions on communities from a scientific perspective. And I don't mean just from the perspective of political talking points and trying to make a point. So and I listed a series of studies, and most of them in highly reputable journals. I'm talking about Nature, about the Lancet, about the British Medical Journal. These are highly reputable publications. And there's a series of problems with sanctions, and in and of themselves, they create humanitarian crises. So in the context of an already present humanitarian crisis, how can we advocate to keep sanctions in place and not give an inch to people who find themselves today in a very difficult position, while still pretending to claim that, first of all, the Caesar Act does not affect relief and humanitarian aid to the Syrian people, and two, that sanctions do not affect people in general, only the people who are part of the regime. So eventually the US administration basically proved everybody wrong, and they themselves said, no, we're going to give an exemption for up until August. So
just to clarify this, because the press release that was issued, the department says that the US basically says that these sanctions programs do not or have not actually in the past targeted legitimate, this is their words here, humanitarian assistance, including earthquake disaster relief efforts. The US government has long had several general licenses in place under CSR that permit most activities in support of humanitarian assistance, including in regime held areas by the United Nations. So it's kind of, if you didn't have sanctions against humanitarian relief, why you're issuing an exemption now? I mean, that's the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, here they engage in wordplay, but I mean, the thing is that yes, they could have issued, or they did maybe issue some general licenses, but these licenses, in order to get that general license, it's a long and tedious process that would take months, and the very presence of sanctions on any country would make anybody who wants to donate such funds think twice. It's no wonder that, for example, Italy was the first European country to send aid to Syria, and that aid was sent around 2 to 3 days ago. That is 4 days after the onset of the earthquake. So and at the same time, I can see that in at least in Lebanon, a lot of people were wondering, how can we send aid to Syria? In Lebanon, there's a country that shares an extensive border with the country. We had no idea how to do it. What are the outlets in order to get there? And there were a lot of grassroots organizing effort, just individuals taking it upon themselves to just pack up stuff and money and then go and cross the border themselves in order to get that aid to Syria. And they also tried to coordinate also from a very in a very grassroots kind of way with people abroad that would send money to Lebanon. That money would be taken in cash and then be taken out to Syria. So yeah, definitely the impact of sanctions can be felt.
Well, one thing I know that impacted the Syrian American community and Arab American community here, even before during this 12 years of sanctions, is just simply transferring money to their family members who are there to help them. As you know, even in the case of Lebanon, many people living in diaspora support their families and send money. But in Syria, you cannot transfer, money. You cannot use the SWIFT system to send money. So when you talk about humanitarian, it's like, okay, maybe some organizations can make it through there, but definitely not, just family members, just as simple as this. Tell us, what have the 12 years of sanctions have done, really? What impact did they have on Syria?
Well, it has yet to be fully understood. Like the full scope of the sanctions on Syria have yet to be understood. However, we can see what sanctions in general have done all across the globe, and then try to deduce what happened, including in Syria, of course. So there's some kind of understanding that, or not an understanding, but like an idea that sanctions primarily target individuals who are part of a regime, and there was recently, especially following the Iraq the sanctions on Iraq, a new term was coined, and that is targeted sanctions, which make them seem more precise, with surgical precision, and that is completely false. So why Iraq? Iraq was the first country, I think, where there was a lot of scientific scrutiny on the effects of sanctions. And during following the first Gulf War, a series of sanctions were imposed on the country. And because of these sanctions, a lot of healthcare collapsed, agriculture collapsed as well. People found themselves suffering even more than because of living under an authoritarian regime or a country at war. So when we think about the dimension of sanctions, we have to bring it down to the individual, and that is, I think, the biggest problem with it. So far away from the people that we tend to hate that are in charge, there are people living in a certain economic space, and these people, in order for them to survive, in order for them to live a 21st century lifestyle, nobody finds all of their needs within their country. Everybody depends on some kind of product that is created somewhere else and brought to them. This is what living in a globalized world means. So, for example, in Iraq in 1995, people found themselves without essential medication. There were this famous example of dialysis machines being stuck in airports because the US deemed them maybe like tools to be weaponized into weapons of mass destruction, which is completely absurd. The dialysis machine never ever exploded anywhere. So eventually this means that people who were in need of essential treatment could not find them. On the other hand, you have fertilizers, you have machines to plant and grow food. These things could not be imported as well. So then agriculture collapses. When agriculture collapses, people cannot access the food they need to survive, the food that they need to transform into other products to sell in order to import other things. So it always starts with, it can start with one thing. Like even when sanctions are targeted, their effects always spread out across the economy, and then the impact is felt domestically and also abroad. So as a consequence of the sanctions on Iraq specifically, 500,000 people, 500,000 children died, according to the UN. And the only reason that we know that it's just 500,000 is that because the UN stopped counting. And I think this is a critical piece of information. The UN decided to stop counting when the number hit 500,000. So
who tracks what's happening in Syria? I mean, you're using a study from Iraq, but really now we really don't know the effect really on what you're saying, the extent of the effect on Syria.
Yeah, I mean, there are some organizations that attempt to track them down, but usually the problem with these with these policies is that their effect can only be seen on a macro scale and always in retrospect. So if I see, for example, a spike in preventable deaths or in specific or deaths because of specific diseases that can be easily treated, and then I look and I compare to the previous years before I had the sanctions imposed on that country, then I can deduce that yes, these people died because of these sanctions. So for example, in Venezuela in 2018, 40,000 people died in that single year as a direct consequences of the sanction. 80% of people, for example, during that same year, 80% of people living with HIV in Venezuela could not access antiretroviral therapy. That is, a direct example of how sanctions can kill people. 300,000 people also in Venezuela during that year who had chronic diseases could not also access their treatment. So in that sense, yes, sanctions do indeed kill effectively. Just because nobody's pointing a gun and shooting them doesn't mean that nobody's actually purposefully making sure that these people will die.
On Tuesday, the heads of the three major churches in Syria, the patriarchs of the Greek Catholic, Antiochian Greek Orthodox, and Syriac Catholic churches released a letter calling for an immediate end to all sanctions. Have you witnessed similar calls from neighboring countries, from, let's say, Lebanon and others who are now calling to end the sanctions on Syria?
Well, there's also, I think, an important call that was made by the director of the Red Crescent as well, as part of an international organization. So, but unfortunately, no. Unfortunately, the thing that I observed most is this, this schism in logic. That is that help the people of Syria, but keep the sanctions on. This discrepancy in the message, and unfortunately, particularly among people who see themselves or consider themselves as of the left, the political left, or they see themselves as anti-imperialists, then this is where the absurdity kicks in. And yeah, unfortunately, there was no organized effort. And while there is a certain call to lift these sanctions, I think that the people who were able to push that message forward found themselves in a logical fallacy, and that is mostly because of either misinformation or the lack of I think that basic scientific logic in order to seek the required evidence to see what sanctions do on the country.
Well, some observers have called for an end to sanctions against Syria in order to get aid to people in need. That's what you're talking about. But experts, I don't know who are these experts, say that's an incredibly misguided point of view. And I'm telling you about experts right here in the United States, by the way, without naming them. They say that the current crisis presents an opportunity for Assad to assert his authority in Syria and ramp up efforts aimed at regional normalization. So, I mean, is human suffering from these devastating earthquakes going to be weaponized for political gains?
Well, I would love to, get these experts' credentials, first of all. Second, there was, as experts, I'm sure they would know of a study that was conducted on, multiple countries that were under sanction from the 90s up until 2011. And that study found that actually authoritarian regimes, the one that, for example, Syria, they fear that it might, normalize its relations with other countries because it is an authoritarian regime. Well, sanctions actually do make authoritarian regimes even more authoritarian, and they actually grant them legitimacy from their own people. It's a sort of, it was called a sort of rally around the flag effect, and that is that when a certain regime finds itself under a threat, but under a foreign threat, then people tend to flock around it. Adding to it that sanctions tend also to reinforce people who are already in power in the system in place, and that is mostly because of clientelistic relations. So when it's hard for you to find bread, in a normal, regular kind of way, what do? You turn to the black market. When the black market becomes extremely unaffordable to you because of the detrimental effects of sanctions and their impact and how much they fuel poverty, then what do? You go and seek out bread whenever you can find it. And it's usually with people who can actually afford to buy it off the black market. So in that sense, sanctions do reinforce the power structures that are in authoritarian regimes, and they absolutely do not democratize countries. Another study actually found that that only 4% of sanctions do achieve the results they were intended to do. And that is like if a country issues a sanction against another one in order to democratize it or force it to change a certain policy or to even create instigate regime change. Well, in the past 30 years, only 4% of these sanctions have succeeded in doing such a thing. So in that sense, if we look at the quote unquote success rate of sanctions, how can an expert bring themselves to say that yes, I will reconcile myself with the immense poverty and the innumerable amount of death and misery, and especially compounding that with an earthquake, just for the sake of maybe a 4% success rate. I mean, this is absolutely criminal.
Let's face it, if you're in power, you're not going to suffer from these sanctions. I'm sure those who are in power in Syria are not lacking bread or meat, on their table like the population who's now suffering in Aleppo or other parts of the country. You work as a doctor in Beirut. Scientists are predicting further earthquakes in the region, basically in the entire Middle East. You don't know where it's going to come next. Is Lebanon ready, and God forbid, for such calamity?
Well, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Unfortunately, there's this, if we look at, natural disaster, when there is, let's say, a tornado that starts off in Cuba and then makes its way to the US, when there is an earthquake that happens in Japan, and then we compare the death rates in poor countries versus countries of the global north, we see a huge discrepancy in the death tolls. So like in Japan, 1 or 2 individuals die, if any at all. The same tornado that starts up in Cuba kills off hundreds of people, and then when it gets to the American coast, only a few people die. Why? And the question is the answer is that, well, first of all, poverty makes you incapable of spending on infrastructure, and 2, austerity measures, and that is that countries of the global south find themselves under stauncher austerity measures than countries of the global north. And what is austerity? Austerity is when the state, your own state, cannot spend on your own security, and that is the state is not allowed to spend on infrastructure to make sure that buildings and roads and bridges do not collapse when there is an earthquake. That when there is such a catastrophe, that your healthcare system has enough resources and manpower to absorb the shock and treat people quickly. It doesn't invest in any kind of or form of security, or like groups of people that would rush onto the site and take people out of from underneath the buildings and rush them to hospital. All of these contingency plans, all of this infrastructure and this manpower is left, it suffers from underinvestment because of austerity. So that is why definitely we can Lebanon is not ready as a country that has been living under religious austerity measures for the past 30 years. Crumbling infrastructure is already a problem as it is. So what would happen when there is a natural disaster? I mean, the man-made disaster we had a couple of years back in the explosion of the port showed that the Lebanese healthcare system is completely not ready to absorb such a shock. And even at that time, I remember people went from Lebanon to Syria at the time to get treatment.
I mean, do you feel in a sad way in these 2 earthquakes, these 2 devastating earthquakes will serve as a wake-up call to neighboring countries, such as, I'm just using Lebanon because you are in Lebanon, but I'm talking about Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, etc. I mean, we're seeing, and I'm sure you know that, just the building continues, building skyscrapers and high rises all over the Middle East. I mean, would this serve as a wake-up call? Let's to kind of improve the infrastructure, to improve the healthcare system.
Well, the thing is that, I mean, I'm not an urbanist and I'm not an engineer, but I know that, it's harder to tear down buildings that have already been built badly and build anew than to actually make sure that in the future, the buildings that are going to be built are built according to a certain, standard that would make sure that they don't fall apart when there is, when there is an earthquake or a natural disaster. So from that perspective, some countries, especially like Lebanon, find themselves in a it's in a too late kind of situation. So what do you do with all of these buildings that have been built? How can you are you gonna kick people out of their homes and tear them down and build new houses with money that we don't have? I mean, these things are kind of impossible to achieve, and unfortunately, we might be coming into we're exposing ourselves to a lot of danger. And but that's not the only issue. I mean, austerity is not always a choice, and that is that when countries find themselves in crises like Jordan, like Syria, like Lebanon, these countries, it's very hard for them to start to get out of this international system that is enforced by the IMF and the World Bank in order to go their own path and start investing in their societies. It would take a lot of political action in order to move these countries to do that, to do such a thing. However, if you look at a country like Turkey, that is, a country that was faring a bit better than the rest, but it's also finds itself also in a crisis. I mean, that country also, they moved entire populations to the region that was hit by the earthquake, and almost all of the buildings were not conforming to any sort of like standards to prevent to withstand earthquakes, even though Turkey has a certain, it's called a tax, an earthquake tax, to make sure that the buildings that are built have these abide by these standards. But it has been waived off for the past few years, and that is why we find ourselves in that situation.
Well, actually, you're right. I mean, they did not improve their seismic conditions, and recently I was reading in the press, Turkey has been arresting building owners and engineers. So they're trying to shift, I guess, the blame on those who are responsible, maybe not the government at large, but individuals.
Yeah, that's the thing about authoritarian regimes. I think they perceive everything, every problem as a problem of security. So when there is, let's say, a health crisis, you put people in jail. You don't let them go out of the house. When there is an earthquake, you have to find somebody to blame in order to arrest them. And I think this is something very similar, either whether it's in Lebanon, in Turkey, or even in Syria. So yes, there has been a huge delay in Turkey and in Syria, providing people with aid. But also there's also the unanswered question of how did we get to this point? I mean, in Syria, it's kind of clear. We know that there's a decade-long de facto embargo, and there is a destructive war. In Turkey, a country that finds itself on the aggressor's end, a country that also occupies part of Syria. What about them? So what is their excuse? And that is the thing is that authoritarian regimes are extremely misanthropic. They just hate their own people. They look at them with contempt. So whenever there's such a crisis, they just want to respond to it in the way that they exercise their own power, and that is with brute force and policing and laying blame on anybody else but themselves.
Dr. Anis Germani, thank you for joining us on Arab Talk.
Thank you.
That's the voice and the face of Dr. Anis Germani, live from Beirut in Lebanon. And Jamal, I mean, what a complete moral abject letdown by the international community in terms of responding to the earthquake when it comes to the situation in Syria right now. What a catastrophic situation there. I mean, on top of the already difficult catastrophic situation that Syrians and Syrian refugees and Palestinians and other displaced individuals from war and civil unrest there has created. On top of that, the earthquake, it's not only devastating for Syria, but obviously devastating for Lebanon and all the surrounding countries. This is really another failure of the international community to take account of what's happening there.
Well, just 12 years of sanctions. 12 years of sanctions for what? To bring down the Assad regime, okay?
Which is not down.
Which is not down. In fact, the Assad regime has been gaining more territory and more control over Syria. Now, whether you agree with Assad or you don't, which we don't, we don't agree with any authoritarian regime across the globe. Do you think Assad and his supporters suffered because of the sanctions? No. Do you think Assad is starving because of the sanctions, or not getting food or on the table or the proper equipment? It's the poor average Syrians who are starving, literally starving, lack medical care and equipment. The farmers who lack also equipment, because the sanctions also affect equipment for farming, which Syria, by the way, before the war was self-sufficient when it came to farming. And you have half the Syrian population now either left the country or internally displaced. I mean, you're looking at just the surviving half of the Syrians inside the country. And what Dr. Germani talked about is the United States contradicts itself, because recently the Treasury Department issued a statement saying that we are lifting the sanctions for 180 days. But at the same time, they say that we have never enforced sanctions on Syria when it came to humanitarian needs.
Complete BS.
So why lift them? And you have a humanitarian crisis now, and you're saying you have never had sanctions. And people are confused about sanctions. They think about sanctions just like about military equipment and weaponry, and it's not. When just a simple thing here, because I've been contacted here I wanted to check with the Syrian American community right here in the Bay Area, and they have problems, and they've had problems for 12 years. For example, just a simple thing, sending money to support members of their family. The SWIFT system that everybody knows does not work when it comes to Syria.
That's right.
And we know countries like Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, etc. A lot of these countries in the Middle East, and of course, I'm just talking about the Middle East, but globally, rely on its diaspora to support members of the family. I mean, this is very common. They travel somewhere. Member of the family works in the Gulf. I'm not talking about just the United States. I'm talking anywhere. But they cannot wire money to support someone supporting their mother or brother or father and so forth. They cannot do that. Okay, so the sanctions really just affect the poor man and woman in Syria. It does not really affect the regime. And if you look at it, and Dr. Germani just spoke about that. It just says, really, there are studies that have been conducted just that show that whenever you have sanctions, actually the authoritarian regime gets benefits. It gets more powerful because it rallies the support. It becomes like a national pride, and they can put the blame on somebody else. They say, you're suffering here in the country, you don't have food because the international community is not sending you food. It's not us, it's not the regime. So kind of they shift the direction of that blame somewhere else.
Well, Jamal, it's an unimaginable tragedy on top of an unimaginable tragedy. And all the political analysis that was provided by Dr. Germani is really brilliant. But we have to face this very painful reality about the kind of deep racism and Islamophobia when it comes to the United States relief efforts and the world relief efforts when it comes to Syria and the Arab world, specifically what's happening in Lebanon and Syria, Jordan and Palestine right now. Because what you're seeing primarily on the mainstream media is what's happening in Turkey. What you're not hearing about as much in as much graphic detail are the thousands of Syrians who have perished, of the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of double refugees in Syria, and the kind of enormity of the crisis that's going on in Syria right now. And of course, you know, as you said, and as Dr. Germani said, this is not hurting the Assad regime. It's only strengthening and empowering them. And then, all these other kind of catastrophic situations in Syria with so many people dead and displaced is not getting any attention on the mainstream media. So, I consider this, not only immoral on the part of the mainstream media, but borderline criminal on the part of these state actors who are failing to get enough relief to especially the Syrians right now. And let's also be clear. In Turkey, for example, it's not as if enough aid is getting into Turkey either. It's just that Turkey is getting somewhat of the press attention right now, but Syria is not getting any.
That's right, and that's why we still have to talk to someone also in Turkey, because also the situation in Turkey is very dire. They have, of course, the earthquake hit South Turkey, I guess worse than Syria, because the numbers now, you've mentioned over 30,000. It's actually over 36,000 dead as of today. 4,000 of those are in Syria, so the rest are in Turkey. So it's very devastating, and this is now week one after the earthquake, and as Dr. Germani said, after 1 week, even though we hear about these heartwarming stories of finding one survivor here and there, but after 7 days, entering on the 8th day and so forth, the finding survivors becomes very bleak. And then the task of now removing the buildings, the rubble, and then what's going to happen? You're going to find more.
Absolutely, Jamal.
Sadly, more of the dead there, and the number is just going to climb up.
Okay, and I think in order to be fair about the situation regarding humanitarian aid, there is another part of the story, obviously, which we have talked about on and off over the years, which is the lack of implementation of certain building standards in the region also, which doesn't help the situation when a major earthquake like this happens. And it's curious to see Erdogan now, who many have described as dropping the ball in terms of his response to the earthquake, is starting to arrest. He's arrested over 100 building contractors now, trying to put the blame solely on the building contractors for the lack of response. So it's a complex issue. We're going to continue to follow it, and I'm devastated already to say that when we report back on this next week, the numbers of dead, missing, and displaced could be over double what we're reporting today. But we'll continue to report on this. We should transition to the bigger fake news that's going on right now, Jamal, which is the fake democracy protests that are going on in Tel Aviv. As we've been reporting here on Arab Talk, there is this outcry among Israelis of not wanting to lose their democracy, since Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing extremist terrorist cabinet is taking over and wanting to basically undermine judicial accountability and using the judicial system, if you can call it that, the Israeli judicial system, to hold accountable the other branches of their government. Netanyahu's going full steam ahead. There are protests in the streets, democracy protests. They're not democracy protests. They're apartheid protests wanting to hold on to the old apartheid system, when in fact this new kind of fascist system, which many people have described it as, Jamal, a really fascist system, is starting to take hold. We have a lot to talk about that, but this comment from this rabbi is really kind of disgusting if you think about it, saying that the dead, the wounded, the displaced, even children, were basically smited by God, that this was an act of God.
Well, just to clarify, this is Chief Rabbi of Safad, Shmuel Eliyahu. He's a prominent figure in Israel's national religious movement. And we're talking about, this is what he said on Friday, that about the devastating earthquake that struck Turkey and Syria earlier this week. He described it as a divine justice in an article published in Olam Katan, a popular conservative religious right-wing weekly newsletter. Just Eliyahu, who's, by the way, his best buddy is the new Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, the head of the far-right Otzma Yehudit party, compared the earthquake to the drowning of the Egyptian forces in the Red Sea in the biblical story of Exodus. And I'm quoting here, "There is no doubt that those who would have seen the Egyptians drowning in the sea and who did not remember the whole event from beginning to an end would have been filled with great pity for them and would have tried to save them from drowning." Then he talks about how Israelites sang songs, and then he turns his words to what happened in the massive 7.8 and 7.5 earthquakes, by saying, "God is judging all the nations around us who wanted to invade our land several times and throw us into the sea. Everything that happens in order to cleanse the world and make it better."
Well, that smacks of using religion and faith to justify the devastating loss of 36,000 lives, men, women, and children. And I don't know what to say about that, Jamal. This is a reflection of the current extremist, radicalized, Israeli establishment.
Just my question is, this story, you didn't hear about it in mainstream media right here in the United States.
You won't.
Imagine if a Muslim cleric or a Christian priest, and he had an earthquake somewhere, be it anywhere, and said, "Oh, that's divine justice." Imagine if someone said something like this, then it would be wall-to-wall coverage all over the media. Here, this was covered, by the way, by Israeli media. And nothing here, because
Of course, and nothing will be covered, and you won't hear anything about it, Jamal. And just like the news of these fake democracy protests in Tel Aviv, I mean, we have to grapple with this situation now. And this has been kind of articulated a little bit in the mainstream media here, that this is the last stand of democracy for the apartheid regime.
I don't know how you can use in one sentence democracy and apartheid, but anyway,
for argument's sake, yeah. You get little hints of this in the mainstream media, but the breadth and the depth of the changes that are going on in the apartheid regime right now, the number of terrorists that are members of Knesset and who are cabinet ministers right now is staggering. And all we hear about is, our State Department and our president basically saying, well, we should let the Israelis come to consensus and work this out. They're not seeing the reality, the big apartheid elephant in the room, Jamal. What's happening in the apartheid state right now is just devastating. Wake up, smell the fascist roses right now, and let's do something about it, because more and more Palestinians are being murdered every day. That illegal settler colonists are taking over large swaths of the West Bank again, Jamal. And Netanyahu's plan with his cabinet is to annex the West Bank, and nobody is paying attention to this.
That's right. So our final story, we have a few minutes here, Jess.
Oh yeah, breaking news, Jamal.
It's not breaking news because we've been talking about it for ages and
for years.
And this is a new story in the Washington Post, and goes more into depth, as you've mentioned, investigative reporting. So people have forgotten. I can't even think about this is since early 2021. We're in 2023, and Trump is planning to make a comeback, or is trying to make a comeback.
He's making a comeback, yeah.
So when he exited the White House, he and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, which a lot of people didn't know, faced unprecedented business challenges. That's very important to think. Business revenue at Trump's properties had plummeted during his presidency, and the attack on the U.S. Capitol by his supporters made his brand even more polarizing. And Kushner, whose last major business foray had left his family firm needing $1.2 billion in bailout. And, so both of them basically were in the red, both their corporations in the red.
But we're putting it very lightly, Jamal. Both their corporations were hemorrhaging money. We're on the verge, especially the Kushner companies, were on the verge of financial collapse. Without these massive billion-dollar infusions from the Gulf and from the Saudi Crown Prince, there's every indication that the Kushner corporations would have kind of succumbed. And who knows what would have happened with Donald Trump's business at this point. But the point being is that they personally benefited from their relationship, which was supposed to be on official grounds. I mean, when you're a president and you're a top legal advisor in the White House, your aim is to protect the interests of the United States. We had been saying for many, many years, and now it's been proven by this investigative reporting, that Kushner and Trump benefited personally from their relationships and work while being on the payroll for the United States.
So the day after leaving the White House, Kushner created a company,
right?
Basically, that he transformed months later into a private equity firm with $2 billion from a sovereign wealth fund chaired by your favorite prince, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And this he didn't have to report. Basically they used a way, or a legal way to not to disclose the source of the funding. This is his business used a commonly employed strategy that allows many equity firms to avoid transparency. That's why not too many Americans heard about this.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you're going from losing money, then you have like $2 billion in your account, which, by the way, later on it rose to $3 billion worth of
but Jamal,
foreign money.
Right, but we're also forgetting the $1 billion+ that the Emirates bailed Kushner out of his Devil Building 666 Broadway. They bailed him out of that too. So basically, it looks like Kushner got well over $3 billion from the Gulf area, Jamal.
And Trump, losing the Trump, organization, which was, as you've mentioned, hemorrhaging money, they got secured an agreement with a Saudi real estate company that plans to build a Trump hotel as part of a $4 billion Gulf resort in Oman.
Yeah, Jamal, it's hard to describe the words to go with this, and that's juxtaposed with Kushner getting away with these I think it's stolen money, frankly, because he benefited as well working in the White House. No one's going to hold him accountable. I mean, we have that saying that apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Kushner's father is a convicted felon, spent time in jail because of money fraud. And now Kushner's doing the same thing. Will he be held accountable? And at the same time, you're not going to like this, but Donald Trump will most likely be the next president candidate for the Republican Party. So
I'm not gonna even think about that. He will be, but I don't want to even think about that. But I'm keep reading more and more about this expose just to kind of understand it. But according to the report, the family hotels, the Trump family hotels and resorts had lost $120 million in revenues. At that point, because of both his polarizing presidency and pandemic. And of course, legal fees because he's facing multiple investigations, etc. And Kushner in 2018, because you're talking about that 2018, required a $1.8 billion bailout. Oh, no, I'm sorry. He required a big bailout because in 2018, because his decision to buy a $1.8 billion office building in New York.
That's the 666 building, yeah.
And so he got a Canadian company to bail him out, and then that's when he went then afterwards to the Gulf. And then the day after Trump administration ended, Kushner created a company called AFIN Management.
Right.
And he used it to springboard to create private equity fund, and that later in the year he called Affinity Partners. I mean, it's a long chain of events to kind of avoid being transparent.
But
and then $2 billion shows up from the Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund, and we know who's behind the Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund. That's the royal family. That's basically.
It's not even the royal family, Jamal. It's MBS.
Well, I mean, he's in control. In March 22, the Kushner-run company filed an investment advisor registration document called Form ADV with the Security Exchange that requires only a vague report. That's why I don't hear about it. Declaring $2.51 billion in assets, and they just listed on it came from non-United States persons. Like you could have like these non-United States people just willing to put billions of dollars.
So if regular people do things like this, Jamal.
And by the way, his firm receives, to manage his own fund, he set up another firm and receives $25 million management fee annually from the Saudi investment, plus it shares in the profit. So all these kind of hoops that they're playing just basically to fatten their pockets. And they've been only out of office for a couple of years.
Yeah, well, I think we have to follow this story, Jamal. The Washington Post did some really great investigative reporting. We'll continue to follow the story. Knowing how the Washington Post works, Jamal, this is probably just the tip of the iceberg of their investigative report. We're sure to find more things to come in the future.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we will talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.